people of Reddit who've encountered serial killers before they were caught. What is your story and how did you find out who they were? So this is third hand, but an old boss went to the University of Utah and was in a sorority. One day she was waiting for her date in front of her sorority house with a girlfriend who was also waiting for her date. Her girlfriend's date pulls up, but her girlfriend forgets something and runs back in the house. My former boss chatted to the man for a few minutes. She noted that he was polite and handsome. Her girlfriend comes out and they leave in his VW Beetle. My former boss gets picked up by her date a short while later, and she thinks nothing of it. The next day she sees her girlfriend and asks how the date was. The girlfriend says that they started driving in her date's VW Beetle and all of a sudden she got a splitting headache. She thought it was really strange but she felt nauseous. She apologized and asked him to take her home. He was a little upset but he dropped her back off. They didn't go out again. Years pass, and my former boss is watching the news one night and sees a familiar man on the screen. It was Ted Bundy. I live in Tallahassee where Ted Bundy killed some sorority members from FSU. I remember when I was young my mom used it as a cautionary tale to prevent me from talking to strangers. A few years ago my friends and I traveled to an old boomtown near the Suwannee River that had been abandoned. There wasn't a whole lot there, but there were some old weird, yet friendly, rednecks who could not stop talking about Ted Bundy. According to them his youngest victim was murdered near the river. They led us to an abandoned restaurant to show us where they swore he hid out at the time of the murder. The whole time telling me how I was exactly the type Ted Bundy was into murdering. The hideout was an old wine cellar and was indeed a creepy place I'd expect a serial killer to hide out in. A serial killer lived in the street behind my aunt's house. Us kids went to a party next door to his house. We'd all seen the guy. Seemed like a harmless old man. A bit scary but harmless. Then the police dug up his patio and found the bodies of 2 young women buried underneath. He'd also killed some women up north. That was an odd time. When my mom was 16 she was sleeping and woke up to someone trying to open her bedroom window. She ran to my grandma's room and told her someone was trying to break in. My grandma, being the crazy awesome lady she is, grabs a bat and runs outside and confronts this guy and starts swinging. The guy runs off and they don't think too much of it. Sometime later my grandma sees the guy on the news and it's Richard Ramirez. My mom told this story over and over when I was growing up. She easily could have been one of his victims. I'm so grateful she wasn't, especially since she was pregnant with me at the time. One of my tutors at university seemed to have a very short temper. First tutorial session was okay, but he spent 5 minutes telling us how important attending his tutorials was. Tutorials are kind of viewed as optional, as they're to go over stuff covered in the lectures. Second tutorial, a few people didn't show up, and he spent 15 minutes ranting about their absence. Third tutorial, even more people didn't turn up, and he spent even longer ranting about it. After that, my friends and I decided it wasn't worth the hassle. Apparently he ranted about the absentees even more at the next tutorial, and I'm not sure if anyone managed to stick out the whole term of tutorials. He'd also help out in lab sessions and various other course-related activities, but everyone found him slightly uncomfortable to deal with. After the exams, we had a bit of a party at someone's house to celebrate. A casual invite was extended to the lecturers, tutors and assistants who'd been involved in getting us through the year. He turned up, none of the other teaching staff did, and although not entirely welcome, hung around for a while. When things were winding down, I headed off, but when I spoke to the host of the party the next day, it turned out that Mr. Angry Tutor had ended up crashing on the living room floor with a load of the others, except they'd all arranged in advance to stay over, but it headed off about 6:30 in the morning. We commented on how odd he was, but didn't give it much more thought, until a few months later, when he was arrested for a violent murder involving dismemberment. He turned out to have a history of violence, and a lot of predatory and stalkerish behaviors. None of that. He was a quiet man, kept himself to himself business. He had obvious anger issues and made people uncomfortable, and it didn't come as a complete surprise to find out how twisted he was. Probably. This was the early 80s. I was about 13 and just getting into Dungeons and Dragons and other interests that would stunt my social life for years to come. A Renaissance fair rolled into town and billed a real unicorn as one of its attractions. I was disappointed to find the unicorn was a poor goat with a cow horn grafted to its forehead. The goat's owners were a trio of hippies, 2 women and a balding white guy with a beard. I remember getting a sinister vibe off the guy. Decades later, I'm reading an article about Charles Ng and Leonard Lake, partners in serial killing. Turns out, Lake used to run a goat unicorn hustle at Renaissance fairs. Guess a guy who tortured and killed up to 25 people had no problem mutilating a goat. Never met one, but my great-aunt was the original owner of the dog that David Berkowitz said talked to him. Actually a mass murderer, but I went to school with a guy who killed his brother, the brother's girlfriend and 3 kids, and did horrible things to the bodies. He seemed like an okay guy. A little quiet, a little angsty, but who wasn't in high school. Went in the same class as this girl. She was rather quiet, but not weird or anything that stood out. One night she and her then boyfriend walked into her sister's room and went berserk on the sister with a hammer while she was asleep. Then they proceeded into her parents' room, them two asleep. They started with the mother, smashing her head, and then the father. When they were done, they walked to the bus station, sat down and waited for the next bus to take them to the boyfriend's home in another city. And there's where the police found them, at the bus station waiting for the bus. Turns out her sister was still alive when they left her to go and kill the parents, and by an act of unimaginable willpower and determination, the sister, beaten close to death with a hammer, managed to get out of the villa and over to the neighbor who called the police. The motive for the act was money. Her father ran a business, and by killing the family she would end up with all the money herself. Thing is, the parents had set up an account for each daughter with a substantial amount of money for their 18th birthday. So if she had only waited a few months she would have gotten a lot of money. Miraculously, the father survived the beating but the mother died. The sister committing the crime is locked in at a psychiatric facility. My great-grandmother used to have a Henry Lee Lucas story. The story went that she was out driving somewhere and she saw a guy hitchhiking. It was different times back then, I'm not sure when this took place, and she gave the fellow a lift. She said that he wrote his name down on a piece of paper and told her to keep a lookout for his name in the paper. Sure enough, she sees it a few months later. I'm not sure how truthful this story was. She never really lied to me, but I never saw her often. But my family is filled with liars, so I wouldn't be surprised either way. I was a senior in high school. I lived in a San Diego suburb close to Santee at that time. I am in no way justifying what he did, but when I had to move from Georgia to Southern California, the bullying in California was absolutely unrelenting. Like Williams, I had moments where I didn't want to live anymore because of the relentless bullying. The kids in Southern California are horrible to non-native kids who move there. I will not reveal too much information, due to the sensitive nature of this topic. I am a U.S. citizen who lived and studied abroad in Egypt during the late 2000s. I attended a large international school there. Many of the local Egyptian students were quite wealthy and came from very affluent families. There were several similar schools around Cairo, and it wasn't uncommon for large numbers of students to go out for nights on the town together, mixing and mingling with students from other schools. One evening, I found myself downtown at a fancy restaurant with a very large group of strangers. There must have been at least 30 of us crowded around a long row of tables. For whatever reason, the topic of bodybuilding eventually came up. I was quite scrawny at the time, still am, to some extent, and asked if anyone had some tips for working out at Egyptian gyms. The guy seated across from me said that he would go get his friend, who was a devout bodybuilder. Met the guy and we shook hands. He seemed nice enough, if not a bit dense. Talked a lot like Sylvester Stallone. Fancy smartphone, nice clothes, fresh haircut. A bro, if you will. Gave me a few tips and went on his way. I remembered his face and name, but not much else. The next time I saw him was several years later, in international newspapers. I recognized not only his face and name, but most of the articles mentioned his passion for bodybuilding. His style had changed completely. That man had become one of the most brutal and feared terrorists working with ISIS, having personally tortured and beheaded hundreds of individuals, later posting the pictures online and bragging about it. Thankfully, it is believed that he eventually blew himself up after leaving a goodbye letter to his family. I was stunned. The guy seemed perfectly normal when I had met him, which makes it even more chilling. How did he end up the way he did? I'll never know. I grew up in Fort Walton Beach, Florida, and in the early 1980s my friend and I would bike to the junior food store, convenience store, to play Galaga every chance we could. There was a weird guy that would come harass us who was about 2 or 3 years older than us. We were 11 or 12. My friend liked to get into fights, so he started calling him Charlie to fluster him. The dude had a huge knife in his boot every time we saw him, so I decided to just ignore him. That was pretty much how it went for the entire summer, and he'd even play Galaga with us occasionally. It turns out, the guy was Frank Walls. Not technically a serial killer but a mass murderer. James Holmes did a presentation at my middle school to teach us about the brain and nervous system. He seemed really smart and he joked around really well with all of us. He was the guy that let us hold a preserved brain, if that makes sense lol. Yeah, would have never known there was anything wrong with him, but I only interacted with him briefly. My buddy's dad was roommates with Jeffrey Dahmer at Ohio State. According to him, he didn't last more than a quarter and would just roam around late at night while everyone was sleeping and microwaved weird foods and generally weirded everyone out, and I might also be a serial killer. I lived next door to a guy that was named the Cowboy Killer. I was maybe 4 or 5 when my sister and I would get babysat by him and his wife. My mom told me his wife would come over pounding on our door in the middle of the night because he would choke her in his sleep. Anyway, he ended killing some prostitutes and getting caught. This was in Auburn around 1990. My high school girlfriend's dad ended up being a murderer but not a serial killer. His persona was basically cool dad. He'd let my friends and I hang out at their house, didn't bat an eye that I stayed there when he and her mom went out of town, made drinks for us, etc. But he also had a hard, sometimes sleazy, and definitely risk-seeking edge. His wife ran a daycare and he kept between 10 and 15 loaded firearms in the house, and at one point, when he'd had a few drinks too many, he asked me how his daughter was with a knowing smirk. 5 or so years later her mom had divorced him for being abusive, and he'd remarried someone much younger and had a daughter with her. He made the news for unloading a clip into his new wife, reloading, and then unloading the second clip as well. He then put their infant child in the car, drove to the nearest airport, left the infant at the curb and hopped the first flight he could to Europe. He was eventually extradited back and, I think, is now serving a life sentence, but only after the district attorney agreed to drop the death penalty. Looking back, the only really spooky moment was when her mom caught us in bed together. They were home and we were decent, but she was really frantic about getting me into the guest room before he found us and freaked out. Something about the way she used that phrase suggested it would be a lot worse than just yelling. The dissonance of her reaction and the questions about his daughter and my sex life was what stuck with me, like he was asking a question to justify rage. My dad met Charles Manson in Yosemite. He says that's where a lot of runaways in the 60s went, so he was probably out there trying to find vulnerable people. Was walking around with a guitar. Offered to sell my dad and his buddy weed. Also told them that he sold his soul to the devil, and that any man he pointed to right then and there could be dead in a second, if my dad, and his friend, wanted them to be. They were a little freaked out and were quick to get out of Yosemite entirely. My dad says that they drove for a while and saw Charles at a stop sign, and it made no sense that he could have gotten there that fast, but I'm not entirely convinced that my dad wasn't just super baked, haha. My aunt went to high school with Canada's most notorious serial killer, Paul Bernardo. She still has the yearbook he signed. See you at the bus stop, Paul. For those who don't know, before he started murdering girls he was the Scarborough rapist who stalked and raped dozens of young women and teenage girls, many of whom he stalked out at bus shelters in the neighborhood. One morning I met up with one of my friends, who we'll call Lucky, at school, and she mentions that she thinks some blonde guy in a shitty white/cream colored car was following her as she walked to school. We agree the situation is weird and make plans to walk home together. Safety in numbers and all that. The next day Lucky tells me that when she got home from school the previous afternoon she told her mom about the car. Her mom then tells her that a blonde man came to the door around lunchtime claiming to have lost his dog, and if she, Lucky's mom, had seen it in the neighborhood. She politely told him she hadn't been outside that day, wished him luck and closed the door. Sometime later, I can't remember how long, Paul Bernardo's face is plastered all over the news, and both Lucky and her mom confirm that he was the same man that followed Lucky and lost his dog. He was stalking her. I don't know if it's true, but one of my old teachers claimed she taught Jeffrey Dahmer how to speak German, claimed he was a nice kid, and good student. My dad knew him in Germany. He was the truck driver for his unit. Dad said he was nice, but he was the only one talked to him out of his unit. Years later, my dad gets a phone call at 2 a.m. in Oz, and it's Dahmer asking for him to pick him up and let him stay the night. My dad is a really nice, evidenced by the fact he would still talk to him when everyone else felt a little creeped out and German authorities were talking to him about some recent murders, but something made him say no. In a year or so, he saw him on TV. He still says he was a nice quiet guy. In late one summer 2002 night my girlfriend called me crying. She ran to the supermarket and had someone following her for a few minutes on her winding trip home around the LSU lakes. She was house-sitting for her aunt in a large home, and got to the point where she did a lap around the lake and her follower was still there. My roommate and I jumped into his car and raced over. She described the vehicle as a white pickup truck, and when we got there, parked on the street one house away from her aunt's home was the vehicle. She was still crying and recounted being followed, the elaborate path, etc. I looked and there was a man sitting in the vehicle. My roommate snuck up in the bushes to back me up and I walked about 25 feet from the vehicle, standing up on the curb and shouted, "Something I can help you with?" And they cranked up, turned on headlights and drove off, giving me a brief glance. I didn't see him in person, but did see him again the following year when he was arrested for a series of murders in the greater Baton Rouge area, and his name was Derek Dodley. I work with a guy who is a sadistic sociopath and absolutely going to be a serial killer one day. Over the past 2 years he's been escalating his violence against women, assaults, rapes, breaking into their houses to assault them, fraud, emptying their bank accounts, pathological lying to everyone. He'll put on the charm to attract a girlfriend and then systemically increase his abuse until they have a breakdown, usually working 2 to 3 targets at a time, some online while others are in person. He managed to pull off a catfish marriage, and when the poor girl showed up he beat her, threw out her family heirlooms, sold her stuff on eBay, took her car keys, emptied her bank accounts and maxed out her credit card/line of credit, told her one day she didn't live there anymore and if she came back from work that night he'd have her arrested as a trespasser. And then fucking did it. He had already started seeing his next girlfriend when she first arrived to move in. She had to move to the other side of the country after 3 months. He would go on to rape another girl, who reported it, and he then stalked and threatened her until she had a breakdown, eventually breaking into her house to assault her again. Although he is facing charges for the breaches and B&D, nothing has stopped him at all. He's moving on to new victims now, convinced the upcoming trial is all a plot by police because they are jealous of him and he's innocent. His kids are right messed up too. CPS must have a dozen files on him, and somewhere they get to stay in that house. He's terrible at his job, but this is the military, so he knows if he does just the minimum he won't get booted, at least not until the trials are done with. Eventually, yes, he will go down for what he does, but I can't stand that it won't be until there are many more victims and one of them winds up murdered. I have no doubt it is his goal to kill someone. I'm not sure if this qualifies as a serial killer. He killed 2 for sure. There's a third murder that seems that he likely did too. Our families went to the same church. Jeff and I co-taught 4th-6th grade Sunday school. My sons were in his class. They even went on his annual weekend camping trip. He was smart, kind and just a quiet family man. He hardly raised his voice and was always patient with kids. To say I had no clue is an understatement. His wife had no clue or suspected a thing from his past. They were married for many years too. He had killed the women long before he and Sandy got married. Also, he pleaded guilty and accepted his sentence, as to not cause his wife and children further embarrassment. I'm from the Chicago area and my family grew up in the city. My dad's friend was offered a ride by John Wayne Gacy, he declined, and my art teacher was in Boy Scouts with his last known victim. He even put up missing child signs and everything. Oh, and my aunt once lived down the street from Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, before he went to live in the woods. Moral of the story: stay away from Illinois. My wife once saw Elizabeth Smart and her abductors. If enough people care, I'll have her post the story here. I was 12 in the fall of 2002 and lived in El Cajon, California, where Brian David Mitchell was arrested for breaking into a local church the following February. My middle school was about 5 miles away from the Lakeside, California Walmart where Elizabeth Smart and Wanda Barzee were spotted that September. I was getting my bike off the rack out front of the school so that I could ride home. It was then that I saw a grisly-looking man and 2 women in what looked to be hijab. I thought that maybe they were Muslims, and with 9/11 having happened just the year before, I knew I wanted to avoid them. The man looked right at me and I felt the coldest shiver of fear run down my spine. I got on my bike and left. Months later, I found out that the people I had seen were Elizabeth, Wanda Barzee, and Brian David Mitchell. It was around that time, according to reports, that he was also looking to abduct another girl. I hate to think that it could have been me, but constantly wonder if I had realized anything if Elizabeth Smart would have been brought home that much sooner. Not me, but my mother. Back in 1976, my mom worked for the city of Pensacola, Florida, during the graveyard shift. She worked with the computers that did the utility billing and finances. One computer, which handled the utilities, was in the main City Hall building, but the finance computer was in the finances office, which was in a separate building across the parking lot. She would have to cross the parking lot frequently to go from one computer to another, as networking as we know it now was just a pipe dream in those days. Nobody parked in the rear parking lot at night. She parked in the front lot. One particular night, there was a VW Beetle parked in the lot that she didn't recognize. She saw the driver of the car sitting behind the wheel. He appeared to be asleep, so she thought nothing of it and headed on to the finance building. She came out of the building an hour later, and he was still there. However, he noticed her as she was coming out of the finance building. He got out of the car and walked towards her. She noticed he had a cast on his arm, like he'd been injured. He was also limping. He called out to her and asked, "Can you come help me with something for a minute?" She had that feeling of dread. Her defenses went up. She said she had to clock back in, but would come right back out. She quickly went up the stairs to City Hall, unlocked the door, and got inside just as he had approached the bottom of the stairs. She locked the door back. When she looked out the window in the door back at him, something seemed off about him. He had this sinister glare on his face. He seemed to catch himself and reset his facial muscles into a more relaxed state and gave a big, friendly smile. He just waved at her and said, "Take your time, I'll wait." She got to a phone, called the sheriff's office, and reported a suspicious person outside of the City Hall building in the back parking lot. She asked if they could escort her to the other building and make him leave. They obliged, and within a few minutes a deputy arrived to the front door. They went out the back, and when the guy saw my mom coming out with the sheriff's deputy, he hauled ass out of there. The next day, that same VW was pulled over at a nearby popular restaurant known for their pancakes, local place, not IHOP, for running a stop sign, and that's how my mom, one of only 2 women who got away from Ted Bundy. I really didn't understand what was happening until a couple of years later, got a bit older and understood what kidnapping and murder really is, which is when I remembered an incident that happened with my cousin and I. We were really young at the time. My cousin was a bit older than I was, and I believe she is the reason I am still alive today. God knows what may have happened back then. We were in a small mall in our neighborhood. It was right across the street from the building we lived in. The mall had more than one entrance, and the back entrance was right across a school. My cousin and I were in the play area, where we usually go to most of the time in the mall, as a very old man came to us and asked us if we saw his kid. Being oblivious to the entire situation, we went walking around the mall with him trying to find his kid. We got close to the back entrance of the mall and he asked us if we think his child went out from here. We said maybe, so we got out and started looking for him. As soon as we got out of the mall, the school was right in front of us, which had school buses parked outside. The old man said repeatedly, "I think I hear something behind the bus, come with me." Luckily, my cousin was very afraid and refused to go and insisted we went back to the mall. After that incident happened, I didn't think of it at all until an old man was arrested for kidnapping children. The second I saw his picture, I remembered it all like it was yesterday. He had already committed the murders at this point, but Carrie Stainer tried to rent my neighbor's house. Me, 12 at the time, and my 17-year-old sister would have probably been prime candidates for his next victims. He was found at the nudist colony down the street. I was a kid. He was my doctor. Can't remember much about him, but he seemed like a normal doctor. He then moved to his own private practice where he went on to murder around 250 patients. There was a guy in Phoenix who went all Texas clock tower with a rifle, shooting people up on a public street. Phoenix police SWAT team eventually took him out. Several months later, a friend of ours breaks out a picture of me sitting next to the guy at their Thanksgiving party, chatting with him on a couch. Oddly enough, he isn't the only person I have met that was killed by a SWAT team, but that is a story for another day. Got into a taxi during rush hour, in the pouring rain, downtown, thought, OMG, I got a cab. How lucky am I? Burned out. By the time we got halfway to my house I knew he was playing games about not knowing how to get there. Had him drop me on a main street near my house. He tripled the fare. Got enraged. I threw all he requested and then some in the front seat and got out. Looked at the side of his cab and saw the logo was hand-painted, and badly faked, and my heart sank as he screamed at me. I ran. He trolled me from his cab in the street while I ran into a storefront, saw his face in the paper a couple months later, the serial rapist and killer they'd been looking for. Our exchange was very heated. He terrified me, and I can still see his face in my mind. I dodged a violent encounter that day. When I was a kid the people who lived across the road were family friends and the father murdered his wife and kids. Strangely enough thinking about it now I don't remember interacting with him even though I know I did. I didn't really find out what happened till a few years later since I was so young and my parents didn't want me to know until I was older, but I kind of figured it out anyway. I couldn't really say much about the guy but I think it's kind of affected my trust issues. Also my dad was talking to a truck driver at a stop somewhere up north about 25 to 30 years ago who intentionally drove his truck into a roadhouse or something. My school's art teacher was in the house during the Ted Bundy sorority massacre. A lot of her friends died. She was in a documentary about it and none of us ever knew. We just thought she was kinda weird. I live in Salt Lake, Utah. During the early 70s, around 71 my mother moved here with some friends. About 3 months after moving here she found my father and was truly smitten. But, a few weeks later she met a very charming man who asked her out on a date. She politely declined, saying she was already seeing someone. The man was Ted Bundy. My middle school hall/cafeteria monitor turned out to be a serial killer. I sat at a lunch table with some of the other social misfits, and the guy would spend 5 to 10 minutes each day just chatting with us. He was nice enough, he smelled a little bit, and I remember that he conversed with us like we were adults. He didn't treat us like crappy 12-year-olds. I started at that school in September 1996, and apparently he took his first victim in October. He killed 7 more women over the next couple of years. By the time he was apprehended in September '98, I had moved on to high school. Just about everyone in the school district knew him, so the anecdotes and analysis started to fly as soon as words started to trickle out about what he'd done. It turned out that he'd been hiding his victims' bodies in the attic and basement of the house he shared with his parents. Buried. My grandpa's aunt bought meat from Edgine and served it to the family on more than one occasion. Was probably normal meat, but super creepy still. Apparently he was just a loner guy in town, but not threatening or anything. I knew an almost mass murderer and he was an acquaintance of mine. He was a server in a bar I frequented and I'd see him around town a lot. I didn't know him well, mainly casual conversation when I did see him. He was always really nice and polite and we had some mutual friends. Then later I read the news and the FBI picked him up for planning to open fire at a specific location in the city. Not me. But my boyfriend lived in the same dorm as the Craigslist killer in college. He said he seemed like a quiet nerdy guy. Apparently he found out he murdered someone by getting a call from a news station asking if he would comment on what happened. I didn't know him and I don't think he'd qualify as a serial killer, but when I was pretty little there was a man in my parish who murdered his sister and her adult son and buried them in the backyard. His house was right up the street from the church and Catholic school, so the gossip was endless. Apparently the cops were only called because all of the neighbors were complaining about the smell. Carla Homolka was the veterinary technician at the vet we took our dog to. I was super young and barely remember her, though my parents said she was sunny, vibrant. You'd never expect a thing. Paul Bernardo was the same, sunny disposition. The two of them earned the nickname of the Ken and Barbie Killers for this reason. They both seemed lovely and you'd never expect a thing. This veterinary clinic was the same place she stole tranquilizers, with which she drugged some of the victims. Not serial killer, but one of my mom's cousins snapped and killed his wife and children and himself a few years ago, and shot the wife's mother in the face with a shotgun. She lived. She's had a lot of reconstructive surgery for it and is actually able to eat again very recently. I see her once a year at a family reunion. From what I understand nobody expected it of him and he used to be a police officer. Really crazy. My mom gave Ted Bundy a ride. She was young and blonde, very pretty. She said he was handsome and polite but she got an extremely odd vibe from him. He asked her some questions about her job, life, kids, then asked to be let off a couple blocks away. She said she recognized him on the news a couple years later. I have a good one, John Wayne Gacy. This didn't happen to me, but it actually happened to my father. During the 70s, I believe, when he was in his late teens, early 20s, he was walking home from work late at night in the middle of winter in Chicago. A car pulled up alongside of him and with a very distinctive voice said, "Hey, do you need a ride somewhere?" My dad replied no, and kept walking. He walked a few more steps, and the car pulled up next to him again, and the man inside said, "Are you sure you don't need a ride? It's really cold out, I don't mind dropping you off somewhere." My dad replied once again, "No, but thank you anyway." The car drove off and my dad didn't think much of it until a few months later when he was watching the news and heard that very distinctive voice once again. The man who offered him a ride was John Wayne Gacy, one of the most notorious, brutal serial killers of all time, killing and sexually assaulting around 33 young men in the 70s. When my dad heard on the news that they had caught the killer, and that it was indeed the man who offered him a ride that one night, he couldn't believe it. He had literally looked in the face of death. My friend lived across the street from the Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway, when he was a child. He said he has few memories of him, but he seemed like a nice, normal man. Serial killers are generally good at not standing out too much. When I was about 12, in the 90s, a nice chap that lived on our neighborhood would sometimes hang out with us teenagers. He was about 50 at the time and worked for a local paper writing on social events. He usually would tell us histories from the dictatorship era here in Brazil and some from his early life on the stage. I guess he was not a serial, but simply a killer. A few years later we discovered that he was being prosecuted for the murder of his first wife. Sometime during the 70s/80s, he requested a divorce and she denied. A few months later they agreed to try to sort things out, going to a romantic trip at a desert beach. Well, he strangled and buried her, thinking no one was watching them. The fact is that a lone fisherman saw the whole thing, but as far as I remember, was either too afraid or distant to help. Sometime afterwards, the fisherman was able to dig her out, but she was already dead. The autopsy found a few pounds of beach sand in her lungs, meaning she was buried alive. This guy never showed any signs of being a killer, and was actually quite funny at the time. Eventually he was arrested, but sometime later was moved to a prison hospital due to poor health and escaped after a few days. He passed away after a couple of years, and I am pretty sure he did not spend even a whole year in prison. What scares me? Our total inability to recognize him as a killer/psycho. Not even a hint. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.